Two Roman soldiers are walking you toward a cross. Your hands are in chains, and in a few minutes, you're going to die. But there's one thing you can say that will save your life. Just admit one sentence. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Say it, and you go free. But according to history, all of the apostles refused. Which raises a fascinating question. Will the apostles really die for something they knew was a lie? Would you? Because this question reveals one of the most interesting arguments in the debate about Christianity. People die for beliefs all the time. Soldiers die for their country. Martyrs die for their religion. But there's a huge difference between dying for something you believe is true and dying for something you know is a lie. Conspiracies almost never survive pressure. Take the Watergate scandal in the 1970s. A small group of people tried to cover up illegal actions connected to former President Richard Nixon. But within weeks, the conspiracy collapsed. People confessed. People testified. People turned on each other. President Nixon eventually had to resign. Because once serious consequences appear, conspiracies tend to fall apart. But the resurrection claim involved multiple eyewitnesses who spent decades proclaiming Jesus had risen from the dead, despite persecution, despite imprisonment, despite execution. Yet we have no record of any apostle ever recanting. If the resurrection was a hoax, which apostle cracked first? None. Then there's James, the son of Zebedee. He was executed by Herod Agrippa I. In Acts 12, verse 1 through 2, it says, "Now about the time of Herod the king, laid hands on some who belonged to the church to do them no harm. And he had James, the brother of John, executed with the sword. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter as well." Early Christian sources say Peter the apostle was executed in Rome during the persecution under Nero. Tradition says Peter was crucified. Some sources even say he requested to be crucified upside down. Why? Because he felt he was not worthy to die in the same way as Jesus. Whether every detail of that tradition is historically accurate is debated, but historians widely agree that Peter was likely executed during Nero's persecution. Now there's Paul. The story of Paul is actually one of the most surprising developments in early Christian history. Before becoming a Christian, Paul was not a follower of Jesus. He was a persecutor of Christians. According to the book of Acts of the Apostles, Paul actively tried to destroy the early Christian movement. He approved the execution of the Christian leader, St. Stephen, and even traveled from city to city arresting Christians. So Paul wasn't someone who was already inclined to believe in Jesus. He was trying to stop the movement. Then something unexpected happened. Paul later claimed that he encountered the risen Jesus while traveling to the city of Damascus. After that experience, everything about his life changed. Instead of persecuting Christians, he became one of Christianity's most active missionaries. He traveled across the Roman Empire, preaching that Jesus had risen from the dead. So why is this historically interesting? Even historians who are skeptical of Christianity generally agree on a few facts. Paul believed he had experienced an experience that convinced him Jesus was alive. And that belief completely changed the direction of his life. He went from persecutor to missionary to eventually being executed for the message he was proclaiming. The Apostle Paul is also widely believed to have been executed in Rome. Because Paul was a Roman citizen, tradition says he was beheaded. So when we talk about early Christian leaders suffering persecution, Paul is one of the most striking examples. If the resurrection message was a deliberate fabrication, why would someone like Paul join the movement and risk his life for it? One historical detail about Jesus' tomb that many scholars discuss, even skeptical historians, is the role of the women as the first witnesses to the empty tomb. All four Gospels report that women discovered the empty tomb. In these accounts, women such as Mary Magdalene, who was known to be immoral but was forgiven by Christ, are the first people to discover the tomb was empty. So why do historians find this interesting? In the ancient Jewish and Greco-Roman world, women's testimony was often considered less reliable in legal settings. For example, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus wrote that the testimony of women should not be accepted in certain courts because of what he described as their levity and boldness. Because of that cultural context, some historians argue that if the resurrection story had been invented later, it would have been unlikely for the writers to place women as the primary witnesses. In other words, if someone were fabricated a story to make it more convincing in that society, they probably would have had made male disciples the first witnesses instead. There's also an interesting detail in the empty tomb account that appears in the Gospel of John. In John 20, verses 6 through 7, the text describes what two disciples saw when they entered the tomb. So Simon Peter also came following him, and he entered the tomb, and he looked at the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but folded up in place by itself. The account mentions two burial cloths, the linen wrappings that had covered Jesus' body, a separate face cloth that had been wrapped around his head. The passage says that the linen cloths were lying there and the face cloth was folded or set apart by itself. So why does this get attention? Some historians and commentators note that the description is very specific, almost like an eyewitness detail. The author is not just saying the tomb was empty, but describing how the burial cloths were arranged. Instead of simply saying the tomb was empty, the account describes what was left behind. So this describes that something unusual happened. Details like that are part of the reason historians continue to examine these early accounts very carefully. Something else historians often point out is the dramatic change in behavior of Jesus' followers after the crucifixion. According to the Gospels, the disciples were terrified after Jesus' arrested. In the Gospel of John, we're told that they were hiding behind locked doors because they feared the authorities. And in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples scatter after Jesus is arrested. From a historical perspective, that reaction actually makes sense. Their leader had been executed by the Roman government. The movement appeared to be over. The sun changed, but something interesting happened shortly afterwards. The same followers who were hiding suddenly began publicly proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. They start preaching openly in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been executed. The book of Acts of the Apostles describes the apostles boldly declaring that Jesus had risen, even when authorities warned them to stop. At one point, they responded saying, "We must obey God rather than men." So why is this interesting? From a historical perspective, that's a dramatic shift. People who were previously afraid of being arrested suddenly become willing to face imprisonment, persecution, and even death. Something clearly convinced them that their message was true. Whether someone believes in a resurrection or not, historians still have to explain that transformation. Why did these followers suddenly become so convinced that Jesus was alive? And that brings us back to the central question of this video. If the resurrection story was invented, why would the people who invented it willingly suffer for it? It makes no sense. What about historical scripts from non-Christians? It's pretty interesting. So early Christians faced real persecution, not just mild criticism. The Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus wrote about the inflictions that Nero placed on Christians. And this Nero guy is pretty evil. He's up there with Hitler. So he recorded it in his work Annals, written about 8116. He writes that after the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, Nero blamed Christians for the disaster. Tacitus describes the punishment this way. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. To serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Okay, so they were burned alive to serve as human torches during Nero's evening festivals. So this is one of the most important non-Christian sources about early Christian persecution. So why does this matter historically? Tacitus was a Roman senator, a respected historian who was not a Christian. In fact, he clearly disliked Christians. Tacitus also confirmed that Jesus was executed by Pontius Pilate, writing, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Yet he still confirms several important points. Christians existed in Rome in the first century. They were persecuted under Nero. Their founder, Jesus Christ, was executed under Pontius Pilate. And Christians were willing to endure horrific punishments. So why would people endure this if they knew the resurrection was a lie? So another excellent non-Christian historical reference is from the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He wrote about Jesus and early Christians in a work called Antiquities of the Jews. It was written around 93 AD. Josephus is important because he was a Jewish historian, not a Christian, writing within the first century. And Josephus, in the death of James, he says this in one passage, describes the execution of James, the brother of Jesus. Josephus writes that James was killed by the high priest in Jerusalem. In the passage, he refers to James as the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. This is important because it shows that Jesus was already widely known enough that Josephus could refer to him that way without explaining who he was. This also proves that Jesus existed, he was known as the Christ, and his brother James was executed. Also around 112 AD, the Roman governor Pliny the Younger, I wonder who the older was, wrote a letter to the emperor Trajan asking how he should deal with Christians in his province. The letter survives as part of his collection called the Epistolae, Letters of Pliny the Younger, specifically letter 10.96. Pliny explains that when he interrogated Christians, they refused to deny Christ. He writes that he tested them by demanding they curse Christ, worship Roman gods, offer incense to the emperor, and those who refuse will be executed. Pliny then describes how Christians worship. He writes that they gathered before dawn and sing responsibly a hymn to Christ as to a God. This letter confirms several things. Christians existed across the Roman Empire by the early 2nd century. They worshiped Jesus as divine, and some refused to deny Christ even when threatened with death. And again, Pliny was not a Christian. He was a Roman governor trying to figure out how to handle this strange new movement. So we have Tacitus, a Roman historian who confirms persecution in Jesus' execution. And we have Josephus, a Jewish historian, mentions James and refers to Jesus as Christ. And we have Pliny the Younger writing about how Christians would refuse Christ even when threatened with death. Neither of them were Christian. Now, many people claim all 12 apostles were martyred. Historically, that statement is not fully supported by early sources. Scholars usually divide the evidence into 3 categories. Number 1, the strong historical evidence. These deaths have the strongest early sources. James, the son of Zebedee, recorded directly in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 12, verse 2, says, Herod killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. This is the earliest documented apostolic martyrdom. Now there's Peter the Apostle. Early church writers say he was executed in Rome under Nero. Sources include early Christian writers like Clement of Rome. Paul the Apostle was also believed to have been executed in Rome during Nero's persecution. There's Nero. Paul wasn't one of the original 12, but he is still a major early witness. And then there's also reasonable early tradition. These deaths appear in later early church traditions, but with less direct evidence. Examples often include Andrew, Thomas, and Philip. The traditions are old, but historians treat them more cautiously. For some apostles, we simply do not know how they died. Examples include Bartholomew the Apostle, Simon the Zealot, Thaddeus the Apostle. Stories about them appear centuries later, so historians are careful about those claims. The one apostle who was probably not martyred was John the Apostle. Tradition says John lived to old age and died naturally in Ephesus, so he likely was not executed. So historians debate the details of how every apostle died, but there is strong early evidence that several of the earliest Christian leaders were executed for their message. Even if some apostles weren't executed, they still faced imprisonment, beatings, exile, and persecution, which still raises the question, why endure all this for something you knew was false? I don't think they thought it was false. So imagine again the moment. Two Roman soldiers walk you across toward a cross, your hands in chains, and all you have to do to live is deny what you've been preaching. If the resurrection was fake, why would anyone choose death instead? Remember, they were willing to sing hymns to Christ even while facing execution. This comes from the Roman governor Pliny the Younger in his letter to Trajan around 112 AD. He describes that what Christians did when they gathered. I mentioned this earlier. They would meet before dawn and sing a hymn to Christ as to a God. This detail might seem small, but it tells us something important. These early believers didn't just claim Jesus existed. They believed he was alive and worthy of worship. And they continued worshiping him even when it could cost them their lives. So there seems to be only a few possibilities. The apostles were lying, they were mistaken, or they were telling the truth. Which one do you think is most likely? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring questions like this, consider subscribing. Thank you. And we'll see you next week.